welcome back to the History Machine podcast. This is bonus episode number 3 on the role of infantry. I'm your host Niall and my co-host
Cathal, hello.
So this is a special episode because often we find ourselves going off on little tangents here and there talking about infantry, and we'll probably still continue to do that. But we just want to go a little bit more in depth into infantry, the role of infantry, what exactly it is, how it's armed, how it's meant to function, what it does. And we think this might be a very informative episode, especially for those who have very small to no knowledge of what exactly an ancient army is composed of and what it should do. So we're going to ignore cavalry for now, but this is going to focus just on the role of infantry. And we're going to go back as far as we can and talk about as much as we can about it, and just give a couple of examples and a few famous battles that are very infantry-heavy battles, which, will help explain how they should or shouldn't be used and where to go with it. So, to start, warfare historically is often treated as some kind of form of hunting. Now, this is going all the way back to the Neolithic age, and this could be something as simple as a raid for livestock, it could be for women, it could be kidnapping slaves, it could just be for the sake of fighting itself. And it's assumed by anthropologists that the earliest forms of warfare must have been between small groups of people in a kind of hit-and-run type encounter. From 9000 BC onwards, warfare becomes really disciplined, and it becomes an organized form of combat from a disciplined hierarchical society with hierarchical command. Now, agriculture requires large amounts of land for cultivation and for the protection of the lands that you're actually using for agriculture. This results in a little vicious feedback loop because you need people to defend the land, you need more land to feed those people, and then you need more people to protect those lands, so you need to possibly acquire more lands. So, what exactly is infantry? Infantry has been the backbone of the majority of historical armies forever. Infantry is the one type of unit that can attack and defend equally well. So the earliest people, and we're talking about the earliest people, they are armed with weapons made out of wood and stone. Now, stone as a material has the advantages of being a very hard material capable of penetrating skin and bone. It's cheap, it's available, it's relatively easy to make the most basic of weapons, but the biggest issue with it is that stones are not at all malleable. Now, I'm throwing out words like hardness and malleable, I would explain. So hardness is the ability of one material to cut through another material. So it can cut, but it can't really be properly shaped. You have to actually cut into it.
No, not unless you have a volcano that you are skilled in using somehow.
Yes. I'm heating up stone that way. I don't know, that sounds like a very interesting pet project now. We need to form stone tools with volcanic heat. But anyway, so the biggest issue with stone weapons is they're not malleable, they're timely to construct very well, it's not possible to forge, and they're virtually impossible to repair. If it cracks or it breaks, it's done. That's it. One of the greatest examples of an effective stone weapon is an obsidian knife.
Who's laughing at the volcano plan now?
And the examples that we actually have don't go far back in history as we think, and that would be the Aztecs and the South American native tribes. So because they didn't have access to good metal, effectively, think the old guns, germs and steel, and that has all its controversies with it as well, but because they didn't have access to metal, they had to use hardened stone weapons. Obsidian as a material is almost the perfect example of what are the advantages and disadvantages of a stone weapon. So obsidian is actually harder than iron. It cuts right through skin and flesh. It's resistant to weather damage, and it lasts almost forever. Now, it is very brittle. Now, what brittle means is if it takes an impact, it can shatter. Think glass. And also, obsidian takes a very, very long time to shape effectively.
But it is insanely sharp.
Yes.
And it can actually be used as a surgical scalpel if you need something for even more fine incisions and the brittleness doesn't matter. It's actually better than like a regular metal scalpel. That's how sharp it is.
Yeah, that's very fair. And at time of recording, it is not FDA approved. But
not on humans. Not on living humans.
Yeah. That's very cool. So yeah, it's an incredibly hard material. It's really, really good at cutting. Obsidian then, because of its hardness and because of its material properties, it's almost impossible to work with. It takes hundreds of man-hours of work to make an effective obsidian instrument. Now, we move on to metallic weapons. Metals are malleable, they're repairable, they're strong, they're hard. They have all these benefits of stone. So metals are suitable for weapons and jewellery, and they occur naturally in nature, but most metallic ores need extensive work and treatment to be useful. One of the earliest metals used for weapons and tools is copper. Now, copper is what you call a soft metal. It can be reworked, it can be repaired, but after an extensive amount of usage, it deforms and you got to fix it again. So you need a skilled blacksmith to effectively reshape the copper. Gold and silver, they're naturally occurring metals. They're as old as time itself. They are obviously very rare, which makes them valuable. They naturally occur from meteorites. Speaking of meteorites, sometimes you get meteorite iron, which literally falls from the sky. And that can be the earliest forms of high quality iron that, humanity would have had access to. So sometimes you can go back to what would be a Bronze Age society and you'll find they have a meteorite iron dagger, which is literally like a space sword. So it kind of has the coolness of that going for it. But, effectively, as long as people have discovered ores and as long as they realize you can heat them up and you can reshape them, reforge them, they've been using that to try and make better and better ones, or to try and make it purer and purer, or try and make it more and more useful for whatever it might be it pretty or be it deadly. Now, most early metallic weapons are made out of bronze. Now, bronze is a composite material, which means it's composed of one or more materials, and it's made of the elements copper and tin. Now, the combination of copper and tin results in a material that has better mechanical properties than either of the elements used to make it. The only problem with it is bronze is a material that varies greatly in quality due to the rarity of the constituency of tin. Well-made bronze is mechanically toe-to-toe with some of the best steel you can find in the ancient world, and it has the added advantage of less rust issues.
And also, when bronze, like its equivalent of rusting, is forming a patina, so in certain applications, that will actually harden it more, depending what you need it for.
Exactly, and if it's going to be a weapon, probably making it harder is even better. The main reason bronze kind of falls out of vogue eventually is you can make a lot more iron than you can make bronze in terms of it's a lot more plentiful, it's a lot more available, it's a much more common element, even though it is heavier. If you add various composites to it, you can make high quality steel. So it all depends on what the society itself can make. But bronze starts first, iron comes in later. Now, for infantry, what types of weapons are used? The most common weapon is the spear. So a spear, if you don't know what a spear is, I'm quite surprised. A pole with the blade at the end. Now, spears are used for medium to long range thrusts, and they have the intention of thrusting at a close quarters range. They have positional and reach advantage. The idea being my spear is longer than your spear, I'll probably stab you first, or I can keep you at bay. They can be used for an attack or defensive purpose because of that. You can keep somebody at a distance, or you can be lunging forward and stabbing someone. They generally have a leaf-shaped blade, and that has the intention of stabbing into the enemy and causing internal trauma. Now, probably the most famous hand-to-hand weapon is the sword. They can be edged, one-sided or two-sided. They can be pointed, or they can be all of these things. Swords are more expensive to make than spears in general. It's kind of a rule of thumb. And the longer the sword, the more expensive it is. Now, you can imagine with the material used, you could make multiple spears for the cost of one long sword.
I feel like a recurring theme on this and any history podcast or media at all is the cool thing that everyone likes, like swords, end up being less useful than the cheap thing that's really quick to train people on.
Yeah, very much so. So swords can be long or short, and they both have their purposes. A long sword has a greater reach, but then again, if you're looking for greater reach, why not just use a spear? A long sword also has more momentum from its strike because it has a lot of weight behind it. But short swords, they're easier to maneuver in close quarters combat and situations. Because it's literally shorter, you can turn it a lot quicker if you need to kind of get underneath somebody's shield or whatever you're trying to do in a very, very close proximity. A short sword has that advantage. Swords, what they have the advantage over spears is they are actually easier to handle than spears in a close combat environment. Now, that's provided you are close enough to use it to an enemy. If you're too far away, it doesn't matter. Swords will break less than spears. There's countless examples of spear-wielding troops where they have reports of the spear has been shattered, they have to get a new weapon, or they resort to a secondary weapon, or they move on. Swords have the advantage. Now, they could be a terribly made swords. They can shatter. But swords have the advantage that they usually do not shatter, or they shatter a lot less than a spear. They're easier to carry on person. That's also important. A sword, it's generally lighter than a spear. It's not a cumbersome weapon. Swords and other short weapons are almost always a better option in confined space. So you imagine if an ancient army is running through a city, a sword is better to try and take into a house than it is trying to take, let's say, a 20-foot long pike. You just can't do it.
But similarly, having a big line of guys with pikes on a battlefield is a bit more straightforward than people
Exactly.
with swords who have to get in really close before they can use them.
For swords as well, a short, rapid stabbing action is considered the best method. A quick lunge forward with a stab. Now, the reasoning for that is it's a minimal distance. We're kind of going to go a little bit into the medical difference of it here. But a 2-inch deep cut into a leg can kill somebody by bleeding them out. But if you have a 20-inch graze that pulls all the way along the torso, but it only goes down like half a centimeter, you've just got a very bad cut. When it comes to delivering a fatal blow to somebody, a short, sharp incision is a better option than a long, drawn out cut.
Especially in pre penicillin eras.
Exactly, yeah. So the long gash might leave you with a Cool War scar, provided you don't die of disease. But the small stab into the leg will probably actually kill you, which is you wouldn't think it would, but that's just the way it is. It's if it hits a vital organ or it hits an artery, that's it. It's over. That tends to be the preferred method of combat. Now, war axes have the advantage of having a bit of weight behind them. So they have rounded edges and they're designed to shatter helmets and the skulls inside them. You could almost view a war axe as a midpoint between a kind of blunted, weighted weapon and a cutting weapon. It can cut somebody, but it can also have that weight and power to come down and shatter through something. And obviously, because it is tapered or sharpened to a point, it puts a lot of pressure as it's coming down.
And forever since RPGs have struggled whether to put it in the bladed category or the blunt weapons category.
Maybe you should have its own little hybrid one, but yes, that's very fair, Kyle. We have gone into spears, but just to mention kind of almost like a subspecies of spear is the halberd. Now, a halberd is a type of a spear with an additional structure for multifunctional means. Think of a spear that is somehow a Swiss army knife. It's got a little bit of extra sticking out in it there.
Saying Swiss army knife, the Swiss Guard, if you look at photos of them, they're pretty much always carrying halberds as well.
Yes, that's true too.
So it just looks like a spear with an axe kind of
yes,
slotted into it.
Gives it that extra little bit of functionality when need be. So the big disadvantage, though, of a halberd is they are heavier, and it's very simply with the law of the lever that, there's more weight at the end, so they're harder to use and they're more difficult to wield. They're also more difficult to make because if you're going to have an elaborate shape, it's not going to be very straightforward. It's going to cost you more. It's why they are in and out of fashion. Sometimes they're very useful. A good halberd is actually a reasonable counter to a long spear because you can sometimes shatter the wood of the spear with the halberd. So they come in and out of fashion, but that's it. Probably the most basic weapon in the history of mankind and history of anything ever is the club. The club is a cheap, easy weapon to have. It's not technologically sophisticated. It's a lot harder to kill an enemy. Depends, if they're wearing armor or not. Sometimes the club is used simply just to incapacitate an enemy. It has its function, has its means. It is incredibly cheap. It appears in and out of history. You'll have people at the Battle of Hastings apparently armed with clubs. You'll also have Stone Age men armed with clubs. So it had a very long shelf life.
The club will always be there, basically, regardless of kind of resources or technology. It's always an option.
Yeah, you'll be able to find some form or the other. So one step higher than a club is probably is a mace. So a mace is a heavy blunted weapon. And what is intended to do is get around the hardest of armors and simply kill by blunt force trauma. So if you're wearing a lot of heavy armor, you go, listen, a sword won't get through this, a spear won't get through this, a halberd probably won't even get through this, the crossbow mightn't be able to puncture through this, but a good hard swing of a mace just coming straight down, it won't break the armor, but it'll break whatever's inside it. And that's the idea. And they became very popular among armoured knights in the Middle Ages and men-at-arms. And that was to get past the absolutely excellently made protective armour of that era. Pardon the pun, bit of an arms race. But that is where maces come into popularity, the better armour gets. Flails, then, is some kind of ball and chain attached to a handle. They're used like maces, but they sacrifice force from the impact with the ability to wrap around with the chain. That has its advantage if it goes up or over or around a shield, or if you need to swing at an awkward angle. The disadvantage is you're swinging around a big heavy piece of metal. It's a lot easier to hurt yourself, and it's a lot more difficult to actually hit what you're aiming for. So we'll move on from the hand-to-hand weapons and onto the projectiles. So a javelin is a projectile weapon, but it has the added benefit of being a close combat weapon in a pinch. If you're stuck there and someone's coming at you and you don't want to throw your javelin, you can still actually use it as kind of a mini spear. Javelins are less effective than arrows for range, and they're not as good as spears as a thrusting weapon. So you have to make the compromise of it can do both, but it can't do either equally well. So on to probably the most famous projectile weapon of the ancient world, the bow. So the bow is entirely a ranged weapon, and their range, the power, accuracy, and the bow size are determined by factors of the bow's material, the shape, the arrow used, and the user firing the arrow. The advantages of bows are you're able to attack very safely at range with impunity, provided that a marksman is securely protected by other troops or in some kind of defensive structure. It's literally a I can hit you, you can't hit me situation. Now, the speed of the projectile, aka the arrow, is very difficult to actually parry. Now, it's probably one of those old martial arts tricks where someone goes, fire an arrow at him and he can catch it in midair. What an impressive thing. Would never recommend trying to do that. But the idea being that you could be out in the battlefield, an arrow can come out of absolutely nowhere, you don't even see it coming, and it hits you. And that is a big, big problem if you're on the receiving end of a lot of bow fire. Now, it can also be used, the bow and arrow, as a supporting weapon for other troop types. Like we can fire some shots to give some literally covering fire, or we can fire shots into a big formation to kind of loosen them up a little bit or cause a bit of chaos. The disadvantages of the bow, it includes a couple of things. The first is there's a lot of time and a lot of skill required to manufacture a bow, and it requires ammunition for it to function. If I run out of arrows and you still have a sword, well, I'm in trouble. That's it. Because I can't attack you at all. The bow itself just can't be used as a weapon. It also has the requirement of additional strings. So a string on a bow can break for a number of reasons. It can break just over effective fatigue usage. It eventually will snap. Or the string can get wet and it can become entirely useless to use. Or just a case of you literally don't have enough strings for your bow. So by not having that, you've nullified your weapon. You could have all the arrows you want, you can have your bow, your string doesn't work, you're kaput. The last big thing that makes the bow difficult is it requires a lot of training and a lot of skill to use effectively. And if you don't know how to use it, it's pretty much pointless. The one up on that is crossbows. So a crossbow has the advantage that it's a very fine weapon made by very skilled craftsmen. Now, we went into this extensively in our Chinese episode as well, but it's good to come back to it. The units who use crossbows have to have very little to no training to use them effectively. You can train them in an afternoon. Now, the crossbow can be a repeatable reloading mechanism, and that's to maximize the output of the shots. Or likewise, you can use rigs and wrenches, and that would maximize the firepower and the penetrative shot of the bolt being fired. A bolt is a type of projectile that's fired by a crossbow or a similar mechanism. Now, bolts are usually heavier, usually better at punching through armor than any other projectile you can find in the ancient world. Now, the power of the bow determines this, and the thickness and the material used for the bolt aids in the punching ability of it to get through the armor. For the crossbow to work, effectively, you need to have good manufacturing in your society. And because you have that, you can have less training for your troops. So you're making the trade-off between having a great manufacturing society versus a society that, has to drill and practice more frequently.
Or if you're medieval England, you've just decided you've invested your whole military doctrine into longbows and you're not going to give them up.
Nope.
You don't care how much easier the crossbow is, you're already dedicated to training everyone in bows and arrows.
And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. So we'll move on to the defensive weapons. A shield. So a shield is a defensive weapon, and they protect against projectiles and weapon strikes, but they can also be used to give you a positional advantage or keeping enemies at a distance, blocking enemies from advancing or pushing enemies back. So think of, modern riot police where they kind of, they have their shields, they'll form up, they'll push people back. Now, they can do a lot of bad things too, but it's that idea that you can positionally control a crowd. Shields can be viewed as an extension of armor. They have some kind of geometric shape that extends outward to cover an area, and they provide that protection from projectiles in close quarter attacks. Now, shields have various advantages and disadvantages. Like all the other weapons we mentioned before, it's based on the shapes, the weights, the materials, and the sizes. So round shields, just a circle, they have the advantage of covering an excellent surface area for the material used. Concave shields, help deflect blows and projectiles. Rectangular shields also cover a good area, but they have the added advantage of being able to overlap with less gaps. Think if you're overlapping circles versus overlapping rectangles. And a rectangular shield also provides protection from downward or horizontal strikes. Because if a downward strike or a horizontal strike happens to hit a shield, those can be deflected up or down or around and can actually cut into the wielder. Those blows could be fatal to the shield bearer. So a rectangular shield has the advantage that if a downward strike is coming straight from above, the top of the shield will actually just take that, absorb it, and it won't bounce it away. Now, concave and curved shapes on shields deflect blows and projectiles, but flat shields are easier to make. They use less material. They're usually marginally lighter. And we'll move on to the grips of shields. So a center grip allows for greater maneuverability. That's where you're grabbing the very center of the shield. It's relatively well balanced and you can move it quite quickly and position it quite well. But a double grip or an arm grip, that makes a shield easier to hold over a long duration. So if you're like shoving your arm through this double grip and pulling it up. For example, now there are shoulder shields and they can just be strapped to the arm. They're usually very light, very small, and it means you don't even have to worry about lifting it or holding it really that much at all, and it provides protection. Now, some shields, this is particularly in the Middle Ages, they have a center spike, and that can be used to either attack, literally by kind of bashing with the shield, or you can parry an incoming attack, or you can kind of control an incoming attack. An honorary mention as well to ceremonial weapons. So it was long considered for the longest time that, you know, you find a very nice shield or a very nice sword or a very nice axe or dagger, and you go, oh, that was ceremonial. It was used for a ritual. Now, usually these stylized pieces probably were used for a ceremony or a ritual. But a very important thing to note is that people like pretty things. And people are willing to put in a lot of time into crafting excellent and elaborate weapons that others are willing to pay multiples the times of costs of the basic or standard weapon or a piece of equipment. So, for example, it will take hundreds of additional man hours to polish a stone axe or a jade axe. But functionally, that axe is actually a lot better and it's a lot prettier. And it could be a status symbol. Just an important thing to mention that every time you hear that, you know, this was a ceremonial weapon, have a think about it because it probably was just something really nice.
Yeah, it would be a bit because I mean, even today you have like katana collectors and things like that, and they're not,
Yeah.
hopefully they're not committing any like ritual sacrifice to their gods or anything with those. Hopefully it is just displayed, and then they make angry YouTube videos about the correct direction to display, so as not to show that you're declaring war on your guests.
Yes, yes. Oh, okay. All right. So we've given a basic lowdown of weapons. So we want to go into armor. So what exactly is armor? What is it? How does it function? What's it been to do? So the function of armor is to provide protection. And this is achieved by sacrificing speed and mobility for protection. So the ideal armor could stop anything that'd be a lethal blow. It could stop anything that, would lead to an infection. You don't get a cut after somebody attacks you. It would be lightweight enough not to tire the person wearing it. And it would retain as much mobility as possible when you wear it. And it would also be breathable enough that you don't overheat when you're wearing it, which, turns out to be a problem. Now, that is the ideal armor. This is kind of magic. This can do absolutely everything and it weighs a feather. That's what it is. But ultimately, what it needs to do is provide protection from the weapons of that time. So for most of military history, there has been an arms race in weapons technology and armor protection. So the armor gets better by a combination of manufacturing design and materials. And likewise, weapons used against armor are improved with the exact same factors. So I make a better piece of armor, you make a better sword. I make a better piece, an even better piece of armor, you might make a mace. It has that feedback. We're all trying to one-up each other for what it does. There has always existed that delicate balance to ensure that the armor is good enough to provide the minimum protection, but not be too cumbersome to hinder the mobility and the vision of the user. That minimum protection is very important because if it doesn't protect you from the attacks and the projectiles of the enemy army, you might as well not be wearing it.
And now and then when you do get big shifts where suddenly you go from like heavy armor to very, very light, it's usually because there's been some offensive innovation where like they're just too fast for you now, and you can't.
Yeah,
It becomes pointless to wear armor at all.
yeah. One of the very famous examples is there's a chest plate of armor in the Battle of Waterloo that has a cannonball that goes right through it.
Yeah.
But it just kind of means you're wearing a very heavy piece of armor, and it's not protecting you from, that level of projectiles. Now, in modern armies and contemporary armies, you're looking at lightweight super materials, Kevlar and whatnot. And that obviously is the idea of I need this to be able to stop, low caliber projectiles. So you'll see the immediate trade-offs between it. So armor gives you the confidence and gives you the protection that you would need to go into battle, but there is always that arms race of will it actually stop what's being fired at me or what's physically coming at me with an attack?
And also, how much money and resources do the people arming you?
That's always the thing. Yeah, yeah. So some of the earliest armor is made by just sewing together animal hides or pieces of bone or ivory or other natural materials. And as far back as you go, you'll find cool helmets that are made of boar tusks sewn together. You'll find ones that are just some form of leather just roped over and sewed. You'll find even in some of the early Greek, Etruscan, and Roman tribes, like a little piece of metal that's held together with string over your chest. So there are very basic armors that can be made, but as long as they provide a bit of protection, that's what they're meant to do. Metallic armor has the advantage over other materials of being stronger than them. It can be shaped into complex geometric shapes. Now, that means you can build it with angles to help deflect attacks. And also, because it can be made into those complex geometric shapes, it can also be made very thick to provide extra protection at various areas. So, similar to weapons, metal armor has the advantage. Now, armor can be made to cover just about every part of the human body, but often it's just made for cost purposes to protect the head and then the torso. It kind of has that priority. It's like if you can only get one piece of armor, get a helmet. If you can get two pieces of armor, get a helmet and get a torso. But those complex geometric shapes of metallic armor also provide really innovative types of armor. So one of the most impressive ones you'll come across is chainmail. Now, chainmail is manufactured by interlinking tiny metallic circles and just weaving them together as if it was made of wool. It's an expensive process, it's a timely process, but the end result is wonderful because you're left with a flexible but sturdy piece of armor. It's relatively lightweight, but it provides pretty much full coverage of whatever the chainmail is covering. It uses less material than other metallic armor, just thin rings of metal. But its biggest disadvantage by far is the time and the expense to manufacture it.
But if there's one takeaway you should take from this, it's to get really annoyed and huffy every time a video game portrays chainmail as the cheapest and least good armor.
Yeah, yeah. And also keep in mind, you can mix and match all these kind of things. You can have a nice little chainmail undershirt and heavy armor on top of it. You're always having that thing of like, listen, can you carry in that much gear into battle yourself and not get absolutely exhausted? But we'll move on. Another type of armor is any laminar or fish scale armor. This armor has the advantage. It's easier to make than chainmail. Still difficult, but it's heavier than chainmail. Now, what laminar or fish scale armor is, it's layers of overlapping material that can be made of either metal, leathers, hides, fur. Just you made of lots of different kinds of materials, and sometimes a combination of it. But you're providing that nice layered protection, and you can shape it to suit, let's say, a torso or a body or a particular shape. Now, it's rarely used by itself, and it's often used in conjunction with chainmail or other types of armor. But that is kind of the next one. And then after that, there are other little different kinds of armor, be something very basic that's just sewn together. Like technically anything could be used as armor. It just depends on whether or not it's being actually useful at its job. So we just wanted to mention the two ones of chainmail and, laminar armor. So back to infantry. That's the bread and butter of this whole episode. What is infantry and what is it meant to do? Now, we've given you like the weapons they have, we've given you the armor they use, we've talked about kind of the shields and the bits and pieces that they would have, the materials, the kind of society that needs to be pulled together to make effective infantry. But what exactly is infantry? Boots on the ground, that's infantry, right? The majority of historical battles have been turned on the ability of the infantry to close with the enemy and attack or hold their position under an attack. Now, from ancient times up until about the 19th century, infantry had two broad means of achieving these ends. Those infantry were either trained or organized into one of two possible ways. So the first type of unit is a shock unit. Now, a shock unit is a type of infantry where the goal of the unit is to close ground as quickly as possible, and they have the intention of smashing through weak spots or driving flanks or using combined mass and momentum and aggression to achieve their goal. Shock troops tend to use concentrated formations and they look to maximize their output in a narrow front. They will almost always be armored and they will specialize in hand to hand combat, close weapons usage, or short range firearms. Now, shock troops are almost always indoctrinated. I'm going to go a little bit into this. Now, this can be religious, it can be cultural, it can be political, but you utilize like a manly code of conduct, all with the intention of maximizing the aggression and the confidence of the unit. You won't find an army in the world today that doesn't train its guys and come out with like, listen, you are the business. You are the best of the best. You are fantastic. You are a killing machine, the manliest of man. And because you don't want to train infantry any other way. You need to create lines, not sheep. That's the goal of the shock unit. Now, the crudest form of indoctrination, this kind of indoctrination, is a tribal indoctrination. And most tribes can trace themselves back to some kind of mythical ancestor or group of people. And those tribes tend to be wary and xenophobic of outsiders. And, that fear is often rallied to generate the ideology of us and them. We're one group, they're the other group. We're lions, they're sheep. That's the kind of thing. That's the crudest way to try and indoctrinate some heavy infantry. Now, these kind of tribes often have some kind of rite of passage for men, usually some kind of coming of age ceremony. Sometimes it's like the Macedonian one is you weren't allowed to sit at the table with the men until you'd killed a boar. And it's a very simple one, but that's it. And if you didn't, you could be 85, but you've never killed a boar, you weren't a man. Doesn't matter. Anyway, in one form or another, tribal culture and warrior ethics survive from the ancient world to the present day. And most cultural coming of ages, graduations, whatever they might be, they can kind of trace their way back to some kind of ancient rite of passage. So I'm going to go back very far here. The earliest examples of warfare are derived from cave paintings. And these usually depict one group of archers firing high volume of projectiles at another group of people who are returning with another high volume of volleys back at them. And the arrows and limbs are drawn on these stick figures, and dead people are being carried or pulled away. And you'll even see some images of cave paintings with figures holding clubs or something that is assumed to be a club, and they're shoulder to shoulder, and the battles seem to be very brutal with very high casualties. Now, once again, these are cave paintings, but that is what is assumed to be the earliest form of warfare. Now, somewhere in the 9000 BCs onwards, agriculture is introduced, and you get more complex societies, and that enables more complex, hierarchical, and highly disciplined armies. Now, the need for agricultural land warrants a need for a standing army or a militia in the event that some other tribe or some other group are going to raid or invade, or some other aggressive peoples are going to come in and take our stuff, and then we're caught out. So a loose and casual army would often be destroyed by a more complex group of warriors, and so shock troops are born out of the necessity to defend a territory. We need to have the equivalent of a police force or an army that are skilled and capable enough to take on or to be aggressive enough to take over an area if need be. And that is the basis and the foundation of your shock troop. So when you amass a large number of people together with the intention of hand-to-hand combat, it becomes very clear very quickly through trial and error that if you're fighting in a relatively organized mass, that is the best method to attack or defend. Then even further, it becomes clear that if you use geometric formations, squares and lines and, sometimes wedges and triangles and different ways to kind of group people together, it's probably one of the best ways to organize people to fight, that, you're protecting the flanks. So somewhere in ancient human warfare, people developed these kind of formations. And the earliest formation that we know of and has stood the test of time is the phalanx. Now, we've gone into the phalanx a lot in Greek episodes and in later episodes and so on, but we'll go through a little bit of it now because it has gone through variations for the longest of time. The phalanx has existed in some form or another over millennia. Some are more effective than others. Not all phalanxes are created equal. Some require more training. Some use different equipment and weapons. But in one form or the other, they all have this in common. They are an organization of troops into ranks and files, and they try to fight as a singular unit. The troops carry a shield, and that shield protects one or more people in the unit from close combat weapons and or projectiles. The troops stay close together in a formation, and they hold up their shields. And the troops use one or more close combat weapons, that's usually a spear, to attack the enemy. Now, the word phalanx originates from the Greek word roller. Now, it can mean fingers as well for the spears, but there's a Greek word that it originates from, which means roller. So it's literally to roll over the enemy. Now, the Greeks didn't invent the phalanx. It has a lot of earlier usage, and it has some kind of common origin in society. You can't be sure. Maybe it's something that develops organically. I've mentioned there are ancient paintings and artifacts such as the vulture stele, which clearly depicts there's a phalanx in usage. It is a formation, as we said, that could have just sprung up organically, or more likely it's just learned from fighting enemies who use it, and we pick it up and we imitate it and we use it, and it passes along an information chain from groups of people to group of people. But anyway, so many ancient and not so ancient peoples use the phalanx. So the Greeks, the Macedonians, the Sumerians, the Phoenicians, they would have all used the phalanx. The Chinese would have used some variation of the phalanx. But let's go as far as the Vikings. They're using some kind of a phalanx. The second type of unit, so we've just covered the basic kind of shock unit. The second type of unit is the skirmisher. Now, the role of the skirmisher is to shoot down the enemy with a longer range weapon. And it is kind of assumed by anthropologists that the skirmisher is the first, we'll say, unit type in human history. It's, people armed with javelins and with bows and arrows, and they're attacking other tribes. It's a lot of hit and run. So it's assumed that the shock unit develops from agriculture, but before that, warfare is mostly hit and run. Now, skirmishers, they're often in a loose and widely spaced formation, or they have no formation at all. And the goal of that is they want to maximize their personal mobility during a battle and minimize incoming damage from projectiles. If we're all grouped together and a bunch of arrows come, it's going to hit one of us. If we're all spread out far from each other, the odds are if one arrow comes in, it might only get one of us.
The shock troops are more like hitting, and the skirmishers are not being hit. They're just all about kind of going from distance, running away faster than you can chase them, and not giving an obvious target to hit that will take out the whole unit.
Yeah. Skirmishers, because they need to get out of there really quickly, they rarely have armor. Sometimes they do, but they rarely have armor. There are cases of skirmishers fighting pretty much naked in battle. It's kind of like, I need to be as light as I can to get out of there. Now, skirmishers perform the roles of, for complex armies, they perform the roles of the scouts, they perform the roles of ambushers, and they can be raiders as well. Most armies in the ancient world are a combination of both of these types of infantry. Your shock unit to deliver the fatal blow, you have your skirmishers to either whittle down enemies or disorder their formation or deal with the opposing skirmishers. The flexible combination of using both types of infantry not only increases the number of options for a commander, but it provides a conundrum for the enemy. Because if an enemy is massed for a shock action, that's like we've got our heavy guys together, we're going to come and we're going to attack the enemy, they can be picked off by skirmishers. But if the enemy then decides we're going to, disperse for skirmishing, we're going to spread out our troops, we're going to try and run down these skirmishers, they themselves become very vulnerable to a shock action. So we're going to go through some ancient infantries and show some of the developments over time, just to give you an idea of warfare and tactics. And in this episode, we'll cover a couple of battles that will be very infantry heavy, and we'll go through, with the history machine, some of the stats. We're going very early. We're going back to the very first type. We're going to Egyptian infantry. Now, the Old Kingdom Egypt, that's 2650 to 2150 BC, they had a militia-based army. So they would have based on a levy of adult males, and that allowed for like an assembly of tens of thousands of people, and they could be supplemented by using some mercenaries. Now, that's the Old Kingdom, and the Old Kingdom collapses around 2150 BC. That's due to natural disasters, civil wars, and the rise of the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom lasts from 2050 to 1640 BC. Now, the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, this army is based on a levy of one adult male for every 100 people. and it's commanded by professional officers who are selected by the pharaoh himself. And in 1720 BC onwards, Egyptian warfare changes with the introduction of the chariot. Now, this episode is not talking about cavalry. We'll have another one that goes into it. But the important part is, for a lot of human history, it's infantry against infantry. And the introduction of cavalry changes how infantry should function, how it behaves. It can't just be man on man anymore. You have to factor in for the idea that somebody has horses. And if you don't have horses, you probably have a problem. But anyway, just important to mention that the introduction of chariots happened. The Egyptians at this time have high quality bronze weapons, and they have a composite bow. Now, the Egyptians previously used bows of simple wood or cane, and that had a range of about 100 meters, which is 328 feet. So a simple one is like cutting down a branch, shaving it a little bit, pulling it there, getting a string and going, I have a simple bow. That's it. Now, that has a range of 100 meters or about 328 feet. That's it. A composite bow consists of a wooden core that's strengthened on the inside of the curve by gluing strips of horn and the outside of it with sinew. Now, the composite bow was invented by somebody messing around with animal remains. That's kind of somebody was boiling tendons and kind of went, yum, 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 I'm going to make these edible, and found out they could make glue, and then with a combination of understanding material properties of natural occurring materials like bone and wood and horn and sinew, glue, was able to go, I think I can make this bow better. And that is what happens. And it's composite because it's a composite of different material. The composite bow is recurved. It's recurved before it's strung, so it almost looks like it's turned inside out. But the idea is that that's how much energy is inbuilt into it. The composite bow was brought from Asia, and it's likely it was developed just through centuries of gradual improvements as well. It probably wasn't just one guy, as I said, boiling tendons the next day he had a composite bow. There's usually gradual changes. But as that kind of technology develops and it gets better and better, people kind of go, we need to bring this and we need to use it and we need to buy them and sell them, and the technology shares and it goes across. So there was a rapid spread from culture to culture. Now, the composite bow at this time, and this time is 1720 BC, it has a range of 200 meters or 656 feet. So it's double the range of a simple bow. This lets it viciously outclass any other earlier bow in both range and power. The biggest thing to mention about this is if I can shoot twice the distance of you, it means you've got all that ground to cover. I can fire with a certain amount of impunity before you even get to me. And also it means I can fire at your horses at a much longer distance before they can get to me too. Another big advantage that the Egyptians have at this time is they have bronze arrowheads. Now that makes those arrows more accurate and it makes them more penetrating. And later composite bows would almost triple this range. This new tech changed warfare and it allowed new armies to develop combat doctrines based on aggressive maneuvers. It's like, we have so much firepower and so much range, we can be a lot more aggressive and we can move into different lines and different shapes and move troops over here and over there to try and maneuver and out-aggress the opponent. Now, at this time in Egypt, there's basic training and it was introduced. A soldier would have undergone just very, very basic archery training before they'd have to expect to engage an enemy. Now, it's not exactly like they were training forever, but it's the basic. Some guy would hand you a bow and say, do you know how to fire this? No. Okay, we're going to have a mini boot camp where you learn how to fire a bow. Now, that might sound basic, obvious, and simple, but imagine if you're part of another army that doesn't do that. And on the day, somebody hands you a stick and a piece of string, and you're trying to string a bow. And there's shots coming at you, and you've never fired an arrow in your life.
This is not theoretical. This is the case for a lot of ancient battles, or even medieval beyond. Probably even today at certain levels. It's
yeah.
There are a ton of wars that are won because one army had a little bit of training.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So you can imagine early Egyptian infantry tactics are based on heavy amounts of bow shot. Now, that's due also because there's a low level of armor expected to be on enemy troops at the time. And then they also incorporate a use of some kind of shock troops. By about 1500 BC, the Egyptians decide to ditch a bronze axe and they begin using a one-handed bronze kopech. and it's got a highly curved edge, but it's got no point. So it's almost a middle ground between a sword and an axe. It's like somebody had a sword and said, I'm going to try and warp this into an axe, and then they go, it's good enough. Now, what this weapon is useful for is it's thought it's particularly effective for pulling at limbs, for trapping arms, or for striking around a shield. Now, that can be very helpful for taking somebody off a horse or off a chariot. That can be very helpful to go, he's got a shield and I can't quite get through him. I can wrap this thing around and pull him out. Or at a close combat situation, I can trap his arms and my buddy can go in there and finish, But about 1200 BC onwards, or about 1200 BC onwards, iron makes its mark as the metal of choice for the offensive weapon. So you're still going to have bronze armor and bronze weapons, but you start seeing the appearance of iron. Iron can now be smelted in small kilns, and you can make reasonable quality iron by separating ore from the slag. So, once you show, now I'm going to tell you this right now, it's actually relatively easy to do that, to make the most simple and basic of iron. You literally need a bit of clay to make a kiln. You get some iron ore, depending on the quality of the ore where you can find it. You can heat it up, and you're going to get slag separate from it, and then you're left with the quality iron, and then you can use that iron to work. And then with that iron, you can make better tools, to make better things, to mine better iron, and it's a nice little feedback loop.
I will say, for those doing this at home, you're almost certainly going to turn good iron into less good iron in the process, by the way, unless you really know what you're doing.
That is very true.
See Chairman Mao's innovations for more
Yes.
details on this.
For further historical examples. But anyway, so with enough of your bashing there, Cathal, we can make some reasonable quality iron from our kilns. But anyway, in 900 BC, enter the Assyrians. So the Assyrians are going to dominate this region of the world for centuries. Now, there often is a comparison made to Nazi Germany, now however crude that might be, but they do have their similarities. Both of them are admired for their advanced military doctrines. They're both admired for their superior weapons technology. They're both the model for future generations of military thinking. And both militaries would allow for oppressive and dictatorial regimes. So the Assyrians, they could assemble an army of about 120,000. Now, this outnumbers the usual army sizes of the time, which is the 10 to 20,000 range. So they're viciously outnumbering their neighbours. The infantry numbers are made possible because there is a mandatory conscription which would be dissolved for the army in time for the annual harvest work. Because, ultimately, we're an agricultural society, got to go home, got to harvest. An example of a tactical advantage that the Assyrians have was they would accompany each archer with the shield bearer to protect them from incoming enemy missiles. And that, speaks for itself in terms of, if I've got a guy who literally has a personal guy with him with a lot of armor and shield, I can keep firing my shots, and as shots come in, we can provide protection, and obviously our archers are whittling down their archers at a quicker rate. But enter the Achaemenid Persians. So they're the later imperial rulers of Asia, and the Persian infantry decide to min-max out bow fire. Infantry warfare in Asia becomes a game of trading bow shots with minimal hand-to-hand engagement, and armor usage is now minimal. So the focus and style of warfare is very cavalry heavy. The infantry is low quality but high quantity. So they got a lot, but there's a lot of them. The gear is suboptimal for most of the troops. A lot of them are going back to using, they're not using composite bows, they're using back at the simple cane bows, but the sheer numbers is going to make up for the lack of good equipment. Now, with all that said, when vast numbers of troops are assembled by the Achaemenid Persians, the majority of the Persian infantry is going to be a rainbow coalition of conquered and incorporated peoples. So there, all kinds of troops can be found within their ranks with their own, specialties and their own equipment and their own armor. So it's not just one unit type that's a guy with a t-shirt and a bow. They're bringing everything. But the idea being that the Persians themselves, their foot infantry, is very lightly equipped with a lot of bows, but there's a lot of them. Now we move on to probably one of, if not the most famous unit type, and that is the classical Greek hoplite. So the earliest Greek infantry seems technologically backward and tactically unsophisticated, right? However, all of these disadvantages are the reasons for the hoplite's advantage. So there's a warrior ethic that remained very strong in ancient Greece. Think of the heroic tales of the Iliad, the stories of demigods and glorious single combats. They have that kind of a cultural thing embedded within them. Now, it's assumed that the Homeric Greek warriors were an unorganized, undisciplined, messy melee, just running in there, everyone for themselves. That's also possibly encouraged and celebrated, single combat. It's very David and Goliath, where honor and prestige are there to be earned on the day in the battle. At a later date, the Greek infantry becomes well more organized and focuses on the unit and not the individual. It's not about you being the hero, it's about you being part of the team. Now, Greek armies take the opposite approach of the Asian ones, and they focus on the heavy shock troop units fighting in a rigid formation. So the hoplites, now we've mentioned a bit of this in the Greek episodes and some in the Macedonian and so on, but we're going to go into it because this is the bonus episode on infantry. But the hoplites get their names from the round hoplon shields that they carry, and it's the one piece of uniform equipment they all wield. Normally, only the aristocrats or nobles of wealthy society can afford equipment, but two factors attribute the Greek citizens to afford this equipment. The first is there's economic development with extensive trade between Greek islands, where typically the standard citizen can now afford the weapons and armors that would be traditionally just heavy infantry. Like if you were a guy who is just a peasant in Persia, you can't afford a bronze shield. But if you are a farmer in Greece, you can. And that's a big difference. And that's totally economic. The second is social and political. So the development of the polis, the Greek city-states, and the rights of the citizen, that provides a sense of purpose for the citizen and participation in state affairs. Because if you're part of the state, you have a stake in the state and you have a responsibility to the state. So that pressure means that you should be well equipped and you should be part of a big team that is there for your city state. Hoplites are unusual in the way that they are very well equipped, but a big thing to note is the level of equipment alters over time and it alters from person to person. It becomes more or less well equipped based on the military requirements and the economic situation and of course the social status of the person. You can probably afford the shield, but can you afford the nice spear and the nice helmet and the greaves? Maybe not. So the Hoplon shield has a double grip. We're not going for the center grip that's more maneuverable, we're going for the double grip. This makes it easier to hold over long periods of time, and that makes sense if you're going to be fighting in a phalanx formation. And it's more suitable for bracing an impact. It's a round shield, it's concave, so this concave shape allows it to be rested on the shoulder, so you can carry it, when you're resting. You don't have to worry that you're going to, well, you are still going to be tiring your arms, but it's not going to be as bad as it could be. The hoplite helmets varied, but the most common type is the Corinthian helmet. Now, this is the helmet we used as a logo.
It's the helmet you're probably imagining when you think Greek helmet.
Very much so, yeah. This helmet protects the vast majority of the head, okay? Listen, your forehead's protected, your nose is protected, your cheeks are protected, the side of your head is protected. It's pretty good. It's got it pretty much enclosed. But you're limited in vision and hearing. When it's worn outside of combat, it's often lifted up and tilted to the back, and it's worn like a beanie. It's kind of this thing of, we only put it down, we need to, because I need to be able to hear what's going on, and I need to be able to talk to somebody, and I'm going to wear this as kind of like a stylish over-the-top hat in the meantime.
And at different points historically as well, you would see that go out of favor for one that is just basically a bronze hat as opposed to a full helmet covering your ears. So it did kind of go in and out of fashion depending on economic circumstances and what other armories were like.
And also these things could be passed down hand to hand. So as much as you might go, it's more economical if you got an old helmet, it might be a Corinthian one. If you got to make a new one, could be something much more open-faced and a simple bronze hat, as you were saying, Cathal. The rest of the armour for hoplites is debatable. Now, this includes did they or did they not use a bronze or linen cuirass. Some of them probably fought nearly naked. This is probably not likely, but it is an option. Bronze greaves and cuirasses have been found in large amounts, so they must have been used by at least a percentage of the army. And they're also depicted on vases, but this could be the ideal hoplite in an artistic representation.
You probably weren't commissioned to do this and then come out with your political commentary where it's showing half of them being, under-equipped.
Yeah, it's like, damn it, man, you're meant to show us looking great on this vase. Now, the amount of armour a hoplite wears changes over time, and we'll go through that later. But with the full setup, a hoplite is covered in a bronze exoskeleton like an armoured beetle. The arms are covered, the legs are covered, the torso is covered, the head is covered, and the shield is protecting a lot of the other area. The main weapon of the hoplite is a 1.5 to 2.5 meter. Now that's 5 foot to 8 foot long ash spear. Now, ash is a very good wood because it can take an impact, it can vibrate, it can shake, it shatters a little bit less, and it's relatively lightweight. So, pretty much ideal for spear usage. And that ash spear has a long leaf shaped iron blade. And also at the bottom of the spear, there's a bronze butt spike. Now, the spear could be held overhanded to thrust forward, or it could be held underhanded so it could be thrust up from below. But the butt of the spike has a nickname, and that interesting nickname is the Lizard Killer.
I love that nickname. You could imagine a modern army calling a piece of their equipment something like that. Like that still works.
But it is, yeah, it's a fantastic nickname. Now, very likely, this butt spike was to kill a trampled enemy. Now, remember, phalanx means roller. You could be rolling over an army.
There are endless debates about like what ancient battles actually look like
Yes.
because we don't really know, when two lines clash, what actually happens. Are they just like poking at one another? Are they pushing? What happens? I imagine a lot of deaths were just human crushes. I mean, I don't have the authority on this, but like you just imagine with everything that's happening, probably a huge amount of the damage is just creating a human crush on the other side. So
Yeah.
the more kind of shoving power, the better, really.
Well, as I said, we can't actually be sure. I can't say definitely, but yeah, it's a good thought process for it. So the Lizard Killer might have been used where you're walking over a trampled enemy, and instead of kind of lifting up the spear or trying to angle it to stab down, you literally just smacked it straight down and into somebody, which is kind of gruesome, but it's probably what it was used for. So yeah, that butt spike was probably used to kill a trampled enemy or a very, very wounded person. But we'll move on. There have been a number of hoplite sword types, but in the 5th century BC, there's two types that are common. One of them is leaf shaped, and it's about 65 centimeters or 26 inches long. So it's kind of like almost a bigger spearhead. The other is the kopis, which is either Etruscan or Macedonian in origin, and that is a 65 centimeter or 26-inch long. Now, it's a dog leg shaped blade, which, if you don't know what a dog's leg is shaped like, I'm going to have to describe it another way for you. But imagine a sword that is long, stretched out, and then the top of it is a little bit thicker, and then it's like angled at maybe 30 degrees. So you have an unusually shaped blade.
Useful when you think your opponent just has too many limbs.
Now, it's actually similar in shape to the modern Gurkha knife. There's speculation that it could be an ancestral sword to that sword. Now, why is it shaped that way? The shape for it is really suitable for striking around a shield. Now, that would make sense if you got hoplite on hoplite warfare, where we're getting close, and my spear is broken, and I get to pull out a sword. And the sword I use, I don't want it to really be stabbing at a circle. I would like to be able to come overhead and kind of hook in a little bit. So that is possibly why it was used. But anyway, the primary weapon for hoplite is always the spear. The sword is the last resort. So you wouldn't go, I'm going to switch to the sword now. It's the spear is the primary weapon. That's the important part. The phalanx, back to it, this formation or versions of it exist in earlier and later civilizations. We did kind of mention, different cultures probably fused and modified it and changed it, but we're going to talk about the Greek one. So the Greek version is considered the kind of apex example of the traditional phalanx. Now, it'll vary and evolve, but for centuries, it is the gold standard for heavy infantry. Now, the earliest of hoplites had round, crescent, moon-shaped shields. That allowed for a spear to be thrust outward from the shield, and they also, funnily, wore horned helmets. Vikings didn't, but the earliest Greeks did, so that's kind of a cool thing. Also, as a note, horned helmets are not a good idea, because it's usually something for somebody to grab onto, and if they can grab onto your head and move you around, it's usually not a good thing.
Depends how much you're willing to die for fashion.
That's true, yeah.
I don't care how useless they are, they do just look cool.
But anyway, over the next few centuries in Greek warfare, the trend is to maximize armor protection. So the hoplite is incorporating a full cuirass, be that bronze or linen, a Corinthian helmet, arm guards, and bronze greaves. After the Persian-Greek wars, the amount of armor is reduced. The reasoning for that is the extra speed and mobility became prioritized over leg protection, and the heavier armor was dropped. Now, this is because if we get a lot of bowfire coming in, we want to minimize that distance. Even though the armor provides a lot of protection, I want to close that ground. So they're like, if I'm not using my leg greaves, just ditch them. That's the case. This version of the hoplite would be replaced by the Macedonian or Macedonian styled pikeman. So I've kind of jumped a little bit ahead there in terms of talking about the Macedonians, but the hoplite Greek phalanx formation relies on each man using their shield to cover the man on the left. This left the right side of the warrior more vulnerable and naturally skittish to lean a little bit to the right side, looking for more coverage from his buddy's shield to his right side, and looking for more interlocking protection. Now, funnily, this results in a gradual, over the day of the battle, a gradual sliding of the unit to the right after it's deployed. So it's kind of the idea of like, I'm just going to take a little step here to the right and try and get a bit more protection from my buddy. And then the guy that you're protecting goes, I'm going to itch a tiny bit closer to you. You can imagine that two phalanxes against each other would ever so slowly just slide above to the right. It's just a part of the way in which it was assembled, and just a funny thing of like it would gradually move, and that became a problem. But the phalanx would usually be 8 to 12 men deep. This would alter, and it would max out in a 50-man deep Thebes phalanx. Now, the extra manpower worked like the tactical steamroller. As you were saying, Cathal, no one knows exactly how this works. A lot of this is speculation. A lot of this is assuming, well, why would you make one that much deeper if you weren't going to use the extra manpower? Is that manpower used in shoving? Is that manpower used in extra spears? Is that manpower used in, bracing? It has to be used somewhere. So the extra manpower is obviously important.
I mean, it is giving up like width in terms of like stabbiness, but if you're just like shoving forward, it's organized and trained. It's just it's very difficult to stand against 50 rows of men running at you.
Yes,
with huge shields.
Yeah, very true. So we're making a big assumption here, but we could assume that the 50-man deep Thebes phalanx probably worked in that whole translation of the roller, the steamroller. It's the tactical equivalent of just punching forward and trampling over troops.
And ideally pointed at the enemy's king, because you don't have as much width, but if you put everything into that one guy, you have a very good chance of just totally destroying the enemy unit.
Very much so. If the phalanx, and this is a big if, but if the phalanx was trained well and drilled, it could be surprisingly maneuverable. Now, when deployed, it could be capable of like feigned retreats, quick redeployments, and kind of steady, coordinated, kept together advances with audio cues. So it'd be, well, here we go. I'm going to give you a small example. The most common phalanx tactic was to move forward to contact. Now, this is according to Thucydides, and I'm just going to put a little quote here. The Argives and their allies advanced with great violence and fury, while the Spartans came on slowly to the music of many flute players in their ranks. This custom of theirs has nothing to do with religion. It is designed to make them keep in step and move forward steadily without breaking their ranks. End quote. You can understand that, like with the audio cues, it's the same as a drummer in a revolutionary army. These kind of well-drilled, well-put-together troops could fight as a very, very effective unit. When other states caught up in that kind of ability, it would be customary to move the phalanx to songs and anthems and take advantage of the uniform movement based on the rhythm of the sound. So sometimes there'd be like a company song that we sing or we hum or we whatever, and we can move to that beat. According to Xenophon as well, the eeriness of seeing a uniform movement of a well-coordinated phalanx was terrifying to behold and would panic an unprepared enemy. They would swish their spears and clash weapons to frighten horses of the enemy. Now, there's evidence to suggest that many non-hoplite enemies didn't ever even engage the formation. They just fled or very slowly backed away and retreated. Now, no one could be absolutely sure how this happened or how often it did or didn't. Like this, the engagement of Greek hoplites and non-Greek hoplite troops could have been an absolute slaughter. It could have been a slow steamroller moving forward, killing whatever's in front of it. And like that, it could have just been, we're here, we're very eerily uniform in our movement and our steps, and the enemy is slowly just backing away, going, don't even bother engage it, don't even touch it.
Probably the outcome depends a bit on like what other unit types you've mixed in there. If you have cavalry to run them down, them running is going to be a massacre, whereas otherwise they probably can just outrun the hoplites if they're heavily armoured. So
yeah, but then you're kind of wondering what direction are the hoplites pushing you into, because they could be, there's lots of things going on.
You might have nowhere else to go.
Exactly, yeah. Now, what we do know from historical accounts, these are just kind of, translations and quotes, but it's that pushes or shield-to-shield shoving or looking for gaps, those were important things for what a hoplite was trying to do. Now, you don't know What's the gap? Is it a gap between men? Is it a gap between a unit? Is it a gap between a formation? Is the shield to shield shoving literally our shields touch and I'm trying to slowly shove, or is it the steamroller going again? Or is the push literally men behind pushing? Is it people at the front pushing? Is it you trying to push a shield out of the way? What is it? But terminology like that is used to describe what is going on. So we can never be 100% sure, but we know that there must have been physical force involved in the phalanx. So some of this also hints at kind of the defensive ability might have been excellent, and there could have actually been a very low output of thrust. Because if somebody's pushing a shield, it's like, why aren't you just being stabbed viciously by the guys in front of you? And maybe there was a very low output of attacks, that the shield, the spear stabs were minimal, and that this unit, how or when it was used, maybe there was a day where like we just need to hold this position, or maybe it's one of this position needs to advance, or maybe it's one of this one needs to steamroll and start lizard killing people. There could be different possibilities of how it's used. It might not have been a uniform unit doing a very uniform thing. It could have had several functions based on attack or defense. But what we can be definitely sure about is the hoplite is an excellent defensive unit. And that's just we assume we're making, as I said, making a lot of assumptions. We're assuming we know how people fight and how formations fight. But back to the spear of the hoplite. Now, the length of the spear gradually increases, and with that, the potential number of hoplite men able to make an attack in the front rows. So the longer the spear gets, it means this guys a rank or two behind are able to possibly put a spear out as well and attack. And that, gives it more of an aggressive stance. A very important for the Greek units as well is their skirmishers called peltasts and their other light troops. Now, the peltast is a skirmisher of Greek origin. Now, like the hoplite, the peltast is named for the shield they carried. Now, the shield is a crescent-shaped wickered shield, usually covered in animal hide. It could not really protect well from a heavy infantry attack, but it's good enough to protect from a projectile. Now, the style of warfare and unit type of the peltast originates in the hills of Thrace. Now, the hilly and forested area made close linear formations unusable, and the hit-and-run skirmishers are much more suitable on this kind of terrain. So the peltast unit type gradually spread around Greece. It originated there and spread out. Now, the Thracian infantry also used the phalanx. We mentioned this in one of our Roman episodes. That's the unusually curved blade, which could hamstring a horse or behead a man with a single blow. They were meant to be kind of like a terrifying weapon to behold, and had to be used by very, very skilled swordsmen. Now, back to the peltast is in essence an anti-hoplite troop. So they spread out, they throw their javelins into the phalanx, and these javelins have a piece of leather attached to provide extra throwing power and accuracy. And the peltasts, being lighter than the hoplite, means they can evade any hoplite advancement and continue to wear down the phalanx with complete impunity. Now, funnily, the phalanx would lose armour to try and make the unit quicker to catch these peltasts, while the peltasts would actually gain more armour to provide extra protection from other skirmishing units. So one unit is getting lighter to try and catch them, and the other unit is getting heavier to protect itself from other units. Now, from the Corinthian War of 395 to 387 BC onwards, light troops are an integral part of any Greek army. Cathal, we're going to talk about a specific battle, and this is going to be a very heavy infantry-based battle. And we can talk a little bit about our old friends, the Spartans, that we gave a lot of guff about, but we're going to talk about them. The Battle of Lechium. So this is a small encounter by an unnamed Spartan commander, which doesn't start well. If they don't name you, it's probably not a good plan. And he is moving some people, and he's unaccompanied by cavalry or light troops. So he's just got some hoplites with them. They encounter a single unit of peltasts. Now, when the phalanx encounters them and they start getting hit with the javelins, they try and send out the younger, faster members of the hoplite unit to chase down the peltasts. But as they run to try and chase them down, they're too slow, they can't catch them. And as they, find themselves out in open water, they're like a school of fish, like, we got to get back into the formation. As they're going back, they're killed by, returning fire. So eventually, as they're unable to chase down these peltasts, the Spartans have a small unit of cavalry arrive. Now, the commander makes a serious mistake. This isn't an episode about cavalry usage, but here's a good one. you should be using this cavalry right now to run down those light troops and cut them to pieces because your hoplites can't do it. But instead, he decides to use the cavalry as a light screen while his hoplites can march forward. It's probably because they're ticked off. They want to be sure we're going to kill these peltasts, but they're like, no, 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 we're not going to let the cavalry do this. We're going to kill these people. So they use the cavalry as a light shield. Instead, then they're actually whittled down further and further and further, and the Spartans are completely defeated. And it's an example of the absolute apex of heavy infantry at that time being taken down by a simple skirmisher troop type. Cathal, what does the history machine tell us about this engagement?
So the history machine on this one, so it gave the Athenians a 76% chance to win this one. It did expect them to win because this is a mix, unit army against just one type of unit. It can see the advantages there that like Spartans can't catch them, so they're going to really struggle to do any damage. And actually the casualties suffered numbers is about what was expected. The main thing that's above average in this one from the history machine's perspective is the casualties dealt by the Athenians to the Spartans. It's about 45% higher than expected. And I think the history machine did a good job kind of sussing out that the different army compositions, in terms of winning odds. So I think that 45% are just the repeated bad decisions by the Spartans where initially they kept trying to chase after them when they shouldn't. They should have known they couldn't catch them and should have probably just started an organized retreat. Yes. And then when the cavalry came, they were just totally misused. And you end up with, even by an army that shouldn't be able to deliver a big shock to the enemy army, they're kind of used to whittle down, they're kind of used to harass they were still able to deal out 45% more casualties than expected. Yeah, fun side note on that, just because you recently lent me a book called The Bronze Lie, which is about the history of Sparta and how they're overrated, basically.
Yes.
And they often did have very inferior cavalry and also very inferior skirmishers, scouts, just light troops. And it does seem that a big part of that was these are the roles usually done by the lower classes because it's the cheaper equipment required. And Sparta had, even by ancient Greek city-state standards, so many slaves relative to the ruling class. They were really afraid to let too many of them learn how to fight at once in case of a revolt. So repeatedly, they just ended up with far too few kind of skirmishers and scouts and really struggled in these areas. Cavalry they also did badly in, but they were able to kind of pick up on that when they had a few kind of client city-states providing that. But on the skirmisher front, which is usually one of the easier things for armies to provide because it's cheap, Sparta were just consistently kind of afraid to field that many of them.
Afraid of that old slave revolt, and then going, well, guys, maybe you shouldn't have that many slaves. But I want to mention something small as well. There's a Greek mercenary commander fighting for the Persians in Egypt, and he equips some peltasts with a 3-meter or 10-foot long pikes, and he uses them in a phalanx formation against hoplites and cavalry. Now, this is possibly a prototype for what we're about to talk about next, but there's no recorded account of these being properly used in battle, just appear and disappear. But their effect on later Macedonian phalanxes can't really be discounted. So, as I said, a very light unit just given extra long spears and used against hoplites and cavalry. So, enter, and we've talked about him before, but we're going to talk about him again, Philip II and the Macedonian phalanx. Now, Philip reorganized his very ill-disciplined infantry by introducing peacetime training, drills, and a professionalization of his troops, and he ensured regular pay. Now, we didn't really go into drills, but it's so important to understand that when you get a bunch of people together to fight as a unit, you should drill them all the time. There's 2 things that make a fighting unit, and particularly shock troops, really effective. And it's either being a veteran unit, as in, I've done this a lot before, or 2, drilling them drilling them to the point of insanity. You have to be able to give a simple command and everybody knows what to do, everyone knows where they stand, everyone knows who's meant to fill what gap. No one has to bat an eyelid at what has to be done next. If imagine a room full of 100 people and you're trying to, who have met for the first time and you're trying to organize anything. how chaotic a mess that is.
I'm bumping into at least 3 people before I get to where I'm trying to go, and then that spot is the wrong spot.
Yeah, yeah. So drilling gets rid of that problem. It's like you need to know what you're meant to do, where you're meant to stand, what your next role, what your next step is, and what you do under particular commands and under particular situations. So drilling, we can't stress the importance of it, and especially in peacetime. But drilling makes an ancient infantry. Back to Philip. He guaranteed land grants after military service, so these guys are going to be pretty loyal. He had them march and train in their full kit. Now, that seems maybe a simple thing to do. Maybe they should be using the equipment they're going to be using, but other armies, if they did drilling or practicing, would usually practice with other equipment or other things and go, oh, yeah, just use a stick for now, and on the day you'll use the spear.
Who needs dress rehearsals?
Yes, exactly. But his biggest reformation at the time was the restructuring of the phalanx. Now, the unit becomes a 16 by 16 men square, which is wonderful for anyone into the hexadecimal system. But 16 ranks by 16 files, that's 256 men. Now, this is important to know. This is the ideal phalanx. So, due to casualties or deserters or whatever, the number is probably almost always lower. But the ideal fully equipped number is 16 by 16, 256. The phalanx could also become 32 men deep to maximize an assault. Now, this goes back to the earlier thing of forming the ranks, making the men deeper. Like, that must have had some kind of advantage, whether it's steamrolling or just extra manpower or shoving, whatever it might have been. But that was used to maximize an assault. Now, Philip himself was a hostage of Epaminondas. You can go back to our episode in Greece if you want to learn more about that. But he likely absorbed ideas and concepts from him for his reformations, because Epaminondas was using longer spears at the time and was wielding nearly to the point of two hands. And the longer spears mean, better range and so on. So he's learning from one of the best and he's incorporating that himself. Now, his biggest change, though, was to radically, this is Philip of Macedon, his biggest change was to radically lengthen the spear, which now had to be two-handed. And this is used to max out the combat range. And this is the Sarissa spear, which is 6 to 7 meters long, which is 19 to 23 feet in length.
So it's like roughly 3 times what the previous standard was.
Okay. This would mean that the first 4 meters or 13 feet projected in front of the formation when they were crouched for a charge. Now that means if you've 16 men in the front, this is a good way to look at it, okay? And 5 ranks of men are attacking from behind. You're not taking on 16 spears, you're taking on 80. It's a pretty big difference. So, and that's before you even get close to the enemy. It's a wall of spikes. It's like a force field of death, and you have to get through that before you get to do anything. So the first 5 ranks of men have the weapons projected outward for the assault, and that means that any non-Macedonian phalanx will be tackling 5 spears before they get to engage the enemy. So you're looking at 80 projectiles instead of 16. But the Macedonian phalanx took the steamroller strategy to a logical extreme. Now, this is by advancing on the double and presenting a dense hedgehog of spear points with a block of men behind them, providing the weight and the power and hoping their opponents will scatter or be impaled en masse or be run over. Now, once again, we're speculating, but this is what we're assuming. Philip would lighten or reduce the armour of his phalanx and minimise the armour in his back ranks. This had the added advantage of saving him cash, because he doesn't have to armour them as well, to make the unit a little bit lighter. This is an important thing to note, and as I said, we're pulling the occasional quote of pushes and shoves and charges, but a phalanx charge has often been described as, quote, irresistible, end quote. And this charge is based on the kinetic energy of the charge. Now, kinetic energy, if you're not familiar with it, is a very simple equation. Kinetic energy is half the mass times the velocity squared. What does that even mean? The mass of the unit, the velocity is the speed, but it does mean that a charge is dependent on the mass of what's coming at it, but it's much more dependent on the speed. So if you double the mass of a unit, you double the kinetic energy. Now, this is assuming the same speed, but if you double the speed, you quadruple the energy. So if you lower your armour and pack the ranks with extra men and advance at double time, A phalanx charge is attempting to max out this kinetic energy formula. You're increasing the speed by reducing a little bit of mass, but keeping a certain amount of the mass. And that is meant to be, quote, irresistible. Later Hellenistic rulers are going to up the armor percentage in their armor. So they're actually losing this speed, and they're going to increase the spear to virtually unwieldy levels for the phalanx. And this is for phalanx against phalanx warfare, because it becomes really popular to use these long spears. So it's like, I'm going to use my long spears against your ones, and I need to try and make them even longer. And if I have extra armor, my troops can probably take the spears more. So they negate the charge by lowering the unit speed and making the unit harder to maneuver or deploy on anything but the most level of terrains. And that's just important to mention. This formation, this Philip of Macedonian phalanx, is the new gold standard, and it's adopted by just about, all of the successor kingdoms, but it becomes the to beat formation. And we're going to get to the people who beat them. Our old friends, the Republican Roman Legion and the Roman Reformations. So the Romans start off as hoplites and skirmishers, just like about almost anybody else. They pick up the technology from the Greeks, they adapt it, and they incorporate it. The Romans have this big distinction that they learn from interactions and they adopt the tactics and gear of their enemies. So, for example, they adopt the maniple formation from the Samnites because it's better to fight on rough terrain. They switch to square shields instead of circular ones, and that's to protect them against head-hunting Celts, because it turns out that Celtic people like cutting your head off during the middle of the battle. It definitely lowered your morale of the unit, but they collected heads. So the idea was they would very often, when they're attacking, just go straight for I'm just going to cut this guy's head right off. So they'd come with a big downward strike or a big horizontal strike with the aim of just cutting off your head. So the Romans used circular shields, which wasn't great at deflecting those kind of attacks, and instead switched to square ones, particularly a square one with a little nice iron rim on the top to protect from a downward strike. So that was completely incorporated to deal with headhunters. They adopt the pilum and the gladius from European contact, and once again, back to their friends the Celts, they adopt chainmail from contact with them. Obviously, the richest of the rich Celtic, princes or chieftains are able to afford chainmail. The Romans take a look at it and say, we need to get this on most of our men. That's the early Roman legion. We have talked about the next few steps, but we'll just go through them very quickly to explain some of the differences. That's where Gaius Marius makes the reformations to the Roman army. He fully professionalizes them. He codifies standards and practices and equipment and changes that have kind of gradually happens and makes them the brand new standard. Also, arguably, after the Marian Reformation, this newly updated Roman infantry is arguably the most effective infantry type ever until gunpowder. They're a sword-wielding troop with square shields, with excellent armor, excellent training, excellent logistics, excellent drilling, excellent leadership. When that happens, sometimes that doesn't always go to plan. But you could make a very strong argument that this is the way to make a shock unit. They have javelins, or their pilum. That's their projectile, so they can throw those in to mess up massed infantry units. They have their excellent, well-made swords. They have their excellent, perfect level of armor. If they are dealing with an infantry type, they're pretty much the apex of it. You do not want to engage a Marian Reformation type legionnaire in hand-to-hand combat with your line against their line. You just don't want to do it. As it moves on, eventually the legions of the Roman Empire, they'll make slight modifications to the armor and weaponry. By the 3rd century AD, you can go back to our earlier episode on that as well, the Romans are going to be less armored, they're equipped less, the tactics have softened, their overall effectiveness is not as good anymore, and the legions is kind of negated. Other societies get better at tactics and equipment and infrastructure and logistics, and the Romans dip in it, and they meet somewhere in the middle. We'll go back to our old friends in the ancient Chinese infantry as well. We covered quite a bit on them, but what separates them from their Western equivalents is if they are armoured, they usually have kind of fish scale or laminar armour that's sewn together plates of metal or bamboo. It's not as effective as chainmail or plate armour, but it provides that kind of protection. They often use the halberds or exotic shaped spears. That's much more common. They use those for different kinds of counter tactics against cavalry or difficult infantry.
Probably shouldn't be surprising that it keeps coming back to cost when we're talking about like infantry, because they are, I guess, the fundamental backbone, most kind of boring, I guess, section of the army. So if you have a giant Chinese army, which we've seen in previous episodes is often like 10 times the size of the European ones, having just one multifunctional weapon and some basic armor makes a lot more
Yeah,
sense.
definitely. Now, we won't go into everything. We barely touched Vikings or Normans. We didn't do anything on samurai. We mentioned the Swiss pike guards. But I think with what we've told you right now, you have the basics of infantry, the unit type, some of the differences, the weapons used. You can kind of envision almost anything else. What we will go into is some of the fighting techniques, just to explain a little bit of what might be done and why. Firstly, stabbing. Very straightforward. So stabbing has the advantage of being quick, singular direction attack. It intends to deliver a fast, fatal blow, and most ancient armies would practice a stabbing technique over any other type of close combat attack. As I said, the Celts might be an exception. We want to collect your head, so for a reason, they weren't going to wait till you were dead. But anyway, that's a separate thing. But most armies would practice that sharp, short stabbing motion, and it would seem to have been the most effective method of combat in close quarters. The big disadvantage is stabbing is actually the easiest type of an attack to parry or counter. Now, sorry, tell a lie. A big slash is an attack we're going to go into next, but slashing has the advantage of covering a very large area of an attack. It's a great way to cut off a head. That's your thing, back to the Celts. But the big disadvantage of a slashing attack is they tend to be less fatal unless it's coming from a horse. And also, you are telegraphing your move. A short stab might be relatively easy to parry, but the idea is a slash is telegraphed. You're seeing that thing coming from a mile away. You can see it, you can block it, you can parry it, you can do what you like. Slashing sometimes gets around an oval shield where direct stabbing attacks won't. So, they have their mixes and matches. But almost always, stabbing is the better option for slashing. Onto formations. Now, we covered many formations like the phalanx, and we touched the tiniest bit on the maniple, what exactly it was. A Roman formation, where the idea is that you can split and remove troops into smaller units and make them more flexible and usable. And it just means that it is often described as a phalanx with a hinge. It has the option of the maneuverability and it can get around. So we didn't really touch too much into it, but those formations have the big advantage of simply strength in numbers. One commonly occurring formation is the shield wall. Now, the shield wall is like a phalanx. You'll see it in the ancient world, you'll see it in later societies. The Vikings use it. So it's where you get a large overlapping of shields and you provide projectile and weapon strike protection. Now, it achieves this very protective layer of shields by sacrificing pretty much any movement for protection. But you know that it's very, very difficult to break through a shield wall. You can be stabbing at it for days with spears, you can run at it with your troops, you can, you can fire at it with arrows, and nothing is probably going to get through. So it's a great way to keep something pinned down, but you almost always sacrifice all of your mobility to do it. It's very basic. It's probably the easiest protective shield formation to teach a group of people. It's probably why it was popular in the Dark Ages, but the shield wall is one to incorporate or to remember. Now, a version of the shield wall that we haven't touched on, and we've probably mentioned it a few times in a few episodes, used by the Romans, was the tortoise formation or the tetsudo. It is a very organized Roman shield formation that provides excellent projectile protection for a slow-moving unit. There's a single layer of shields in the front, a lovely, nice row of shields, and then there's a layer of shields from every rank behind it overhead to provide a roof of protection. It actually looks like tiles on a roof. And the idea is the unit can carefully move forward if need be. They've got their short swords out and they can stab at close formation if they have to. But it's a great way that if an enemy is attacking with, arrows and darts, javelins, whatever it might be, they can just slowly move forward and not worry about getting taken out by a random projectile. Other unusual formations exist. Some of them we know very little about. One that was meant to be used was a wedge or a triangle infantry formation. Now, we can make the assumption that, like its cavalry counterpart, it's used for a quick charge, but the biggest disadvantage of a wedge is if you have a shield on your left-hand side, that whole angle on the right, with everybody in the wedge, has no shield. So you got a whole side that's completely open and possible to counterattack. But anyway, it's all speculative, but at some point, wedges and triangular formations were used, maybe to good effect, maybe not. but they're little things that are hinted here and there or mentioned. So there are many formations we haven't talked about. There are many we just simply don't know how they work, how they were intended to work. Did they work? Were they efficient? What was the case? We don't know. So we have a lot done there and we've a lot covered, and we've covered quite a bit of infantry. I want to go into with you, Cathal, here, a great example of an infantry war with various types of infantry units, with a clashing of technologies and techniques and logistics and everything that we have talked about infantry, where we have different types taking on each other with different effects and different outcomes, and to just express everything that we've gone through. And we'll take a look at some of the battles of the Third Macedonian War from 171 to 168. So, like the name says, it's the Third Macedonian War. So we're going to have a case where a very inexperienced Roman army and commander, Crassus, I was going to say, not that Crassus, an earlier one, not the one that dies at Carrhae, but another Crassus, they cross into northern Macedonia for the Third War. Now, the Macedonian king is Perseus, and Perseus is at war with the Romans, and he wants this to be a short, sharp, quick campaign that he can win with his excellent Macedonian-style phalanx, take out these Romans, send them all packing home, and remain the king of Macedon. That's effectively his goal. The Macedonian king, Perseus, he is waiting for an attack, and he's waiting, but no assault comes. Now, this is due to the Romans finding the terrain that they're traversing across Macedon extremely difficult. Their Thessalian allies of the Romans are the only group who seem organized enough or care enough to actually traverse the environment well. Now, just to mention the Thessalians, they are very serious in this war, and they take it very carefully, because they know that if this thing goes wrong and they lose, the Romans are just going to go home. But the Thessalians, they're going to be the largest part of the persecutions that Perseus will deal out when this is all over. The consul Crassus decides he has to rest his men after this difficult terrain. And this leads up to the Battle of Callinicus of 171 BC. So the Romans are 3 miles away from the city of Larissa. Perseus is camped 5 miles away from the Romans. He gets tired of waiting for the Roman assault. Been here quite a while. This is using up a lot of resources. He's a man of action, so instead he decides to go on the offensive with some skirmishing. Now, the terrain is unsuitable for either side's heavy infantry, so both sides are going to hold them back for this battle. Now, about 24,000 on each side are engaged in combat, and this is going to be Roman skirmishers, and cavalry are going to engage the Macedonian cavalry and the light infantry. Now, the Macedonians and the Romans have roughly similar cavalry numbers. The Macedonians probably have an advantage, but the Roman skirmishers and the Macedonian skirmishers are going to take it against each other. The Macedonian irregulars include Gallic and Thracian infantry, and they make short work of the Roman cavalry. Now, they do this with the phalanx blades, they do this with their javelins, but they deal with them. And the Macedonian cavalry finds itself unopposed on the battlefield, and it smashes apart the Greek infantry who are allied to the Romans. Now, the Romans are saved by the allied Thessalian cavalry, and how that happens is the cavalry keeps formation and pressures the Macedonian units that have decided to overextend outside their formation, and they allow the Romans to retreat successfully to the safety of their camp, where they'll have the numbers and they have the heavy infantry. Perseus is not vigilant enough, and the Roman troops retreat further into the night, and they safely make a river crossing in the process. Now, Cathal, what does the history machine think about this battle?
So this one was one that it had similar numbers on each side. So the win over expectation, it has 50%, because it just ranked it as a roughly 50-50 battle. The casualties dealt by Perseus is about 15% higher than expected, and his casualties suffered is about 10% fewer. So it's quite an interesting one in that, yeah, they're both starting off with similar, I guess, units, but the different unit types and the difficult terrain just kind of allowed one side to defeat in detail the other, more or less. They could kind of take on one section with, they kind of looked at, where's the paper, where's the rock, where's the scissors, and kind of picked the right one at the right time. To take them on.
I love it. But rock crushes scissors, but paper foils rock. Scissors cuts paper. Oh no. The history machine ultimately thinks close enough battle. Perseus did a good job dealing with it.
I think, if anything, it highlights where the history machine can't know all the details, because it does have it as 50-50, but obviously this is where, I guess, being a good general helps, and being able to identify the terrain, being able to identify what components of your army are good at what.
Yeah, yeah. So, as we mentioned, Perseus was not really vigilant enough. Now, he's very bad for scouting. He's very bad for reconnaissance. Remember, he was just sitting, waiting to go, where are the Romans? I'm at war.
It's so rude.
When I declare war, I show up. It's like, perhaps they are waiting. It's like, if only you knew, buddy, how caught they were, you could have went on the offensive. But you didn't, because your scouting was terrible. And that's by Roman standards. They have the worst scouts. So anyway, he doesn't pursue his victory. They get to escape in the middle of the night. Now remember, they have a nighttime river crossing. That's how little his army figure out what's actually going on. It's like, we wake up the next morning, it's like, where are the Romans? They're gone. Oh, did we not find out about that? No, we didn't, sir. Oh, all right then, I suppose. Anyway, but back to our Crassus here. He decides to pick out 5 Greek officers, and he scapegoats all of them for the loss. He's a perfect example of upper management. And he sends this information back to the Senate, and he tells the Senate in so few words that, sorry, this lackluster performance where the Roman army went into Greek territory and Macedonian territory and didn't perform well, it's all down to these 5 Greek officers. If it was just me, I would have done so much better. My only regret was delegating work to these people. That's kind of the thing. So, this guy totally covering his own. But anyway, Perseus, though, doesn't pursue his victory. Now, it's very likely, this is important, that Perseus believes, and this is after the Punic Wars, that if he annihilates a Roman army, they're going to send a more competent commander to avenge the loss. So he hopes that if he leverages a number of soft wins, he can demonstrate to the Roman Senate and the decision makers that Macedon is not really worth the trouble. And he's looking to get favourable peace terms where he can sit down with some Roman negotiators and go, hey, all right, this is all up. I still get to be king. You go home. That'll all be fine. Offers the Romans some kind of, like, we can do some kind of peace agreement, you know. So if I obliterate your army, you're definitely going to keep coming back, because that's just what you do at this time, or that's what particularly the Romans do at this time. They will double down on losses if they're that drastic, but if it's kind of an embarrassing loss, he might be able to get something out of it. So the Romans do offer him peace terms. The peace terms are he has to surrender himself and his army and his kingdom to Rome. So
Not the best.
No, it's not. It's like, I thought I had a stronger bargaining chip when I went in here. So obviously, he ain't going for that. So in 170 BC, the Romans are reinforced by some African troops. So they get, importantly, the famous Numidian skirmishing cavalry. We didn't really cover them in this episode. All you need to know is they're light cavalry. They're some of the best in the ancient world. They're excellent at picking off troops. But more importantly, they get 22 elephants. So the elephants are going to be back here. We're going to see how well they're going to do. Now, it's important about the elephants. Perseus cannot quite deal with elephants this time. They're known to the Hellenistic kingdoms. Alexander fought against elephants. Other Hellenistic kingdoms incorporate elephants into their army. But at this time, Perseus cannot deal with them. Now, the reasoning is horses can't really deal with elephants. So he tries to condition his cavalry with some training. So imagine, if you will, he puts together a big, smelly grey structure, because he's actually painting it with smells and mucuses and whatever. And there's these big grey models. He puts trumpeters inside them, and he has them trumpeting and bellowing sounds to try and imitate the roar of an elephant. And with these models, he has these horses charge by nearer and nearer and gradually to the noisy structures to try and condition them. Now, we have no idea if this training worked or not. It probably doesn't, because Perseus decides to make a retreat to fortified cities instead. But it's just really funny to mention that he's sitting down and goes, I can't really deal with these elephants.
Yeah, it was a good effort. I couldn't deal with an elephant either, and I think I would just give up. I don't think I'd try something that creative.
Fair enough. So Perseus decides to retreat to his fortified cities instead. So by 169 BC, the Romans are taking the war the war with Perseus a lot more seriously. They kind of go, listen, we mocked it up the first time. Did not go well. Crassus was an absolute nightmare in terms of a commander. I know he scapegoated a lot of people, but come on, he's got to take some responsibility. So the Romans decide they're going to send a much more serious character. So they send Marcus Philippus. Now, he is familiar with the kingdom of Macedonia because he was friends with the previous king, Philip V, and he was also the ambassador to Perseus. So he knows the man personally. So Marcus Philippus, or Philippus for short, he's going to take his troops and he whips them into shape and he loads them up with supplies and he heads up north into Macedon. Perseus follows him and cuts off further supply and bottles up the Romans in some bad terrain. The Romans were well stocked to begin with. You know, they were, as I said, whipped into shape and they brought a lot of stuff with them. But they've made a very fatal mistake here, allowing themselves to be cut off. Because although they're well stocked to begin with, they are losing resources at an alarming rate. And Philippus is adamant to keep his elephants. Now, elephants, if you don't know a lot about them, they eat a lot. Perseus has very poor reconnaissance. We've mentioned this before, his scouting is terrible. So the next move is entirely missed.
Losing an elephant definitely qualifies as bad reconnaissance. If you didn't see that elephant there, that can't be good. But go on.
Yeah. So Philippus, as much as he's got this wonderful CV, you used to be friends with a previous king of Macedon, and you were an ambassador to the Macedon, and he goes, you're the perfect guy to send. It turns out he's actually really incompetent. So they made a bad choice. They looked at the CV, and on paper he made sense, but in practicality he didn't. So he turns out to be this very incompetent general. He is knowledgeable about the court rulings of Macedon and how it functions, and that's about it, okay? In a Hannibal-inspired move, he's about to try and program his way out of this one, but he executes it incredibly poorly. He forces his elephants and troops over inhospitable mountainous terrain, suffering many, many casualties in the attempt. And they end up forcing their way over the mountains and into southern Macedon. But they find themselves in another bottled up position. Back to Perseus. He assumes, with his terrible, terrible reconnaissance, that the only way the Romans could be gone from where they were meant to be is if that they forced their way through one of the passes that was guarded, because no Roman commander he's faced before would ever be as stupid or do something as suicidally stupid as risk the terrain that Philippus has just crossed. It doesn't occur to Perseus that he might have done that. It's great when a Hannibal can do it, because Hannibal was able to do it well, but this guy couldn't. Perseus is ignorant to the horrible actions of Philippus. As Perseus moves towards Philippus, this is Philippus's saving grace, because they were almost out of supplies after managing to, get over the mountains and keep those elephants. Philippus's army get Romans in Macedonia to get supplies from one of Perseus's garrisons that were now left because he went to try and find where the Roman army went. And then those Romans were able to meet up with Philippus, provide him with supplies, and get his army back into fighting shape. Philippus wisely steps down from command of the army before he can do any more damage, and he lets other officers take control.
Acknowledging you're just not very good at something is an undervalued skill. Like, knowing when to cut your losses and not having the ego, it's underrated.
Yeah. It is. Because you know what? Yeah, sometimes you just need to know when you're kind of like, I was out of my depth. Yeah. If this was a negotiation, I should have been put in the front lines, but it wasn't. This was a battle. And my CV said more than what I could actually do. I lacked the skills required. But now, here we are. Perseus finds out the sequence of events of they did what? Over where? With who? And in hindsight, he is stunned at the incompetence and the sheer luck of his opponent. So in 168 BC, the formidable Macedonian army, which has somehow managed to get outmaneuvered by its own actions, is now still ready for this big showdown. There's a new year, it's a new consul, it's how the Roman system works, and this time it's Licinius Aemilianus Paulus Macedonius. And you can guess by the last part of the name how this guy does. So he comes from a long line of military men. His father fought against Hannibal during the Punic Wars, albeit it was at Cannae. Big loss. But anyway, he was the consul who didn't run away, Cathal. He was the one who fought to the bitter end. So he comes from a great line of military men. Licinius Aemilianus Paulus firstly looks for a serious reconnaissance report on what was going on, who was where, who controls what, and why. This is a blind battle with a lot of moving, a lot of people climbing mountains, cutting off passes, moving from garrisons. It's messy, and it's messy because you don't know what's actually going on. The findings of this initial report include, among many, many things, that the Romans are lacking in infantry, and Perseus was too well dug in to attack directly. This is the current situation.
He's willing to wait this time. He's not going to be impatient and just go for them.
So time now for an infantry situation. The Romans go, we have to up the infantry number, get the reinforcements we need, pull that together if we want to actually engage this guy. The Romans get a further 8,000 Roman infantry from a one Publius Cornelius Scipio. He's not the one who fought Hannibal, he's a relative of him. But anyway, he is sent with reinforcements via naval support. And after a feint, these two Roman armies join together to make one large main army. Now, this battle we are about to cover is one of the most famous, well-studied, and typical examples that is given for the dominance of the Roman maniples over the traditional Greek phalanx, the hows and whys. This is, two ideologies are about to smash against each other. One of them is going to come out on top, and why? This is the Battle of Pydna of 168 BC. Now this, as I said, is the example battle given where the Roman maniple just obsoletes the Greek phalanx. Now we'll debate this more, but that was the take-home finding of this battle. So the first thing about it is the terrain for this battle was very suitable for the phalanx. It was flat, and the flanks are very secured by natural features. There's a mountain and there's the sea. And that means you could just make a very long and uniform infantry line of Greek phalanx units if need be. Now, it also means that a cavalry encirclement is virtually impossible for both sides. So this now, by the terrain, by the situation, is going to be an infantry battle. It's what it is. The legions are going to go face to face with the phalanx. So legionaries are going to take on heavy Macedonian phalangites and other different light troops. Now the Romans still have their elephants. They've actually gotten a few more. They have 34 elephants for this battle. And they're going to use them. And we'll see how. But the Romans and Scipio are eager to fight. But Paulus tells them to relax and rest the army. Okay? We don't want to go too aggressive on this. Remember, my dad is the guy who died at Cannae because he did not want to engage them, and the generals that went forward and engaged are the ones who died at Cannae. This is the life lesson I'm taking from my father. Just relax, take it easy. We don't have to get that aggressive. Now's not the time to fight. Ease up and prepare for it. That's that. The rest is to the Roman advantage because, and we can date this battle because of the event, on the 22nd of June, in 168 BC, there is an eclipse. Now, the Macedonians see this as a bad omen. They interpret it that their kingdom is literally being overshadowed by the new Roman one. And the Romans don't really see it as much of an omen at all, but the Greek troops take it home as like, oh, this is a bad sign. This is a very bad sign. This is a very bad omen. Now, this omen would not have happened had the Romans not decided to rest. So you can add that amount of morale into your little infantry equation here. Perseus releases a single horse straight into the Roman lines to try and get the Roman light infantry to come forward and instigate a battle. Now, it doesn't go as planned. It doesn't trigger it. Now, I don't know if it's like, here's a horse, first guy to get it gets it. Or also, here's a horse, just send some troops forward and we'll meet. But it doesn't work. but he tries to do it.
I have gotten that glitch in the AI to work in Total War. I'll say that much. There are definitely times that I can make them do stupid things by manipulating horses just the right way.
That's very fair. It doesn't go as planned this time, though, Cathal. So Paulus spends the morning sacrificing oxen, looking for a good omen to attack. And he keeps getting no's. Like, they kill an ox, they pull it open, they check the entrails, they go, no, signs aren't good. On ox number 21, the priests, possibly realizing, all right, he's going to get us to kill a lot of animals. They go, yeah, conditions look good. So the Romans set up the army and they get ready for a battle. And the Macedonian army swings into action. And this is very cool because, in lovingly detail, it's recorded what they're going against. The Macedonians are bringing Thracians, who are described as huge men with brightly polished shields, black tunics, with their legs protected with greaves. They have heavy iron spears. They have mercenary soldiers armed in the native styles. A third unit of hand-picked men, the bravest and strongest native Macedonians in the prime of their life, in golden armour and scarlet coats. And these were followed by the brazen shield phalanx, armed with steel and bronze shields. Now, Perseus, in this line, has control of the right flank, and he's armed with a special unit. And Cathal, this is the spiked cuirass unit. You imagine there are guys wearing literal armor that's covered in spikes. And apparently, this is an anti-elephant infantry unit. Now, Cathal, this is going to be a fantastic anti-elephant unit. So it's meant to be, if you are trampled, not if, but maybe when, you are trampled by the enemy elephant, you will be sure that you cripple said elephant with your spiky armor. It's like, I'm sorry, we're doing what?
That is an amazing notion. Next Halloween, I'm dressing as a caltrop and for elephants.
Yeah,
it's too weird to ignore.
it makes me think that possibly the horse thing didn't work. They're like, we got to try something else. So Perseus, anyway, he has armed, remember, with his spiky cuirass troops to deal with the elephants. Whether or not this cripples the elephants, Cathal, we won't be sure. We'll go into it a little bit. But it may also be like stepping on Lego, and if that might only infuriate the elephants even more. But we'll find out. Paulus himself, the Roman commander, lines up with legionaries against what are called the Bronze Shield Phalanx. Albinius, who's an ex-consul, he's at this battle as well. He lines up to fight a second legion against the White Shields. So this is very cool that the idea is obviously there's famous units and different ones and guys that have clearly gone, hey, we'll all have white shields, we'll all have bronze shields, we'll all have whatever, we'll all wear black tunics, this is our thing, we're that group, we're that unit. So maybe more to that at a later date, but you'll get units that kind of go, we're that thing, we're these guys, we're that name, that's our thing. He's taking on the white shields, that's Albinus. The battle will begin on the right flank. Now, the elephants make short work of the anti-elephant units. That's recorded. They trample them and they keep going. It didn't work. So the battle is not going well on the right flank because of the elephants. Meanwhile, there are Italian allies, and these are the Phalangians. Now, they are very hesitant to take on a phalanx head-on. There is a wall of spears seemingly impenetrable. Now, a Roman officer gets very annoyed, he grabs their standard, and he hurls it into the Macedonian phalanx. Now, this inspires the Phalangians to rush into the spears, and they are promptly slaughtered. It is as if they have jumped into a pit of spikes. It does not work. Now, the Romans very quickly learn from this mistake. Even though they sacrificed Italian allies to do it, they go, oh, okay, we cannot rush this thing. If we do, it's going to be murder. When Paulus is facing his phalanx, at a later date, he's going to admit, he's going to be celebrated for this idea of like, oh, you did so well at that battle and weren't you so brave and so everything. And he admits later that the sight of a well-drilled, well-put-together, solid, uniform Macedonian phalanx formation gave him heart palpitations. He was so terrified. He apparently was scared beyond belief, and that he admitted that this was one of the most terrifying things. Now, this is a guy who was a battle-hardened veteran. He was used to combat, but seeing this thing scared him stiff. And it's just important to mention how terrifying a well put together phalanx just looks. The spear formation is frustratingly difficult to deal with. Now, the legionnaires, like their Italian allies, are kind of impaled on oncoming spikes. The Roman legionnaires have the advantage that they've got the pilum, they can fire into the enemy, that might kill a few people. So you're seeing a little bit of skirmishing ability against the heavy, dense Macedonian formation. Now, the Romans, who normally their doctrine is to charge forward and cut through the enemy because our infantry is better than your infantry, they find themselves very slowly losing ground and inching backwards because any advantage of trying to press forward doesn't work. Now, the way that the Roman line is spaced and the way that the Macedonian line is spaced, normally the Macedonians have a 16 by 16 man formation. And as we said, that's 5 spears facing forward. And that works out that 16 men actually have 80 spears projecting forward. In this case, each Roman soldier has to fight not 5, but 10 spears because of the gaps. It's almost an impossible task to get through it. You have 10 guys who are looking forward, stabbing with spears at one person. It's an almost impossible task. So the Romans slowly, with their big, heavy, square shields, they're figuring out that the nice, heavy armor they have is providing protection, but they just cannot get past this unbelievable wall of spears. It cannot be done. They're moving back, inching piece by piece as some of their allies are retreating. They're like, come on. We're going to have a full rout if we're not careful here. They're slowly losing ground. Now, here's the thing to note. The son of Cato the censor drops his sword in this retreat in a state of panic. And for the sake of not having to explain to his very formidable father that he had somehow dropped his sword and had lost it, he and his friends decide to hurl themselves into the formation. Now, miraculously, they survive. The fighting is ferocious. They push back a little bit of a Macedonian phalanx line. They retrieve the sword and they come back. But that gives a bit of a morale boost to the rest of the lines. And there's loads of examples across the line of Macedonian slaughters where Romans went too forward, or heroic situations where Romans were able to get in behind the ranks and kill a few people and get out kind of safely. But there's a lot of little back and forth. Now, eventually, this uniform line of Greek phalanx becomes almost a zigzag pattern. Like the white shields are going a bit forward, the bronze shields maybe moved a little bit back. Some lines are a little overextended, some are pushed back. And this makes this battle. Paulus is meant to have spotted this opportunity, whether or not he did or the rest of the officers anyway, but he's taking credit for it. He spots this opportunity and orders the Romans to break into maniples and take advantage of these small zigzag gaps that have formed. Now, the gaps have formed, as we said, from the lines going back and forth a little bit, but also as the Macedonians have come forward, they've actually encountered a little bit of uneven terrain. And uneven terrain in a unit as uniform as the heavy Macedonian phalanx, it cannot really deal with that. That is why the Romans themselves dropped the hoplite formation when fighting the Samnites to adopt the maniple one. This is their opportunity. So there are these gaps. Now, as I said, they're called gaps. Are they gaps in men? Are they gaps in lines? Are they gaps in units? But they're gaps. Now, this is the key moment, and it's the reasoning given to legion superiority over the phalanx. A few Romans are able to get past the initial 14 feet of spears into the formation. And when they get into that formation, they are like sharks in a frenzy. They are killing everything they can get their hands on. Because once they have gotten past those spears, they are fighting Macedonian and Greek units who are not used to sword warfare against troops that's all they do is sword warfare. And they are cutting into this chunk of men. Now, that killing frenzy is going on. Now, Perseus is meant to have seen this collapse of his infantry as the Romans bleed into it and cut it to pieces. And along with a light injury he had gotten from a deflected spear, he retreats with his cavalry and he allows his infantry to be doomed. Now, the Romans, after the scare they're given at the initial harsh part of the battle, they absolutely slaughter everything they can. As I said, they were terrified. They came in very brazen. They discovered they could not get past that wall. They became a little bit terrified when they realized some of their Italian allies were just absolutely cut to pieces and some of them were running away. Now that they're in this killing frenzy, they're slaughtering everything they can. They are so frustrated at the formation they couldn't get past that once they're in it, they're cutting it. Now, any Macedonians who try to surrender are instead killed on the spot. This is not common practice, but it's what was done. Some Macedonians wade into the sea to try and escape, but the legionnaires, this is how ferocious they are and how bloodthirsty they are at this battle. They will get on boats, they'll sail out and they'll kill them. The Romans then get their elephants and they loose them on the Macedonian troops to try and trample them to death as well. This isn't done because they can't kill them normally. This is done because they go, I want this guy to die in a really horrific way. And I think elephant trampling is a good way to do that. It's carnage. And the Macedonians seeing and realizing that surrender is no longer an option. 3,000 of the heaviest infantry, the heaviest Macedonian pikes, seeing this carnage, change their tune, they switch their stance, they're going for a last stand, and they fight very bravely in near perfect formation to the last man. But it doesn't matter, they're surrounded. Once they're surrounded, they are going to be whittled down person by person until they are massacred. Now, the Roman massacre only ends when it becomes too dark to find somebody to kill. This is how bad it is. The next day, there's a river a mile away that was reported to have run red from thousands of dead troops just seeping in from the surroundings. The aftermath of this is brutal, but this was an infantry battle. Minus the elephants, the cavalry had almost nothing to do for the day, but this was two very well prepared lines that were supported by skirmishers battling it out to find out who was going to win the day. And the lines were striking and preparing against each other. Now, Perseus retreated and he gets a lot of flack for that, but ultimately, once his infantry line collapsed, him staying there would have been a valiant cavalry battle where he would have been killed. So, but once they started to collapse, it was over. Now he retreats and he gathers his treasures and his family, and he's looking to make his way to Asia. He's going to go into a self-exile into some Hellenistic court, live there for the rest of his days. Perseus is tricked by the naval passage that he's booked to get on, who wanted to be paid in advance. And once they were paid in advance, they just took all the gold and sailed away and left him to be handed away by the Romans. I want to make a very quick note about this, and it's important for lessons for yourself and even for this historical example. But historically, this is very out of character for Perseus. He famously used to wait to pay his mercenaries at the end of the battle. And he'd say something like, I ain't paying you until this battle is won. I'm not paying you to not show up. This give me half now, give me half later. It's like, what? You want me to give you half your money and then you don't show up on the day? It's pointless. No, I will pay you when you have the job done. So it's very out of character, and it showed him how desperate he must have been that he paid somebody to get him on a boat across into Asia and had agreed to pay him all. And, I'll pay you in advance, and then had everything just stolen from him. But anyway, he's captured by the Romans and he's handed over. Ultimately, Perseus and Pella are now under Roman control. And this actually upset the legionaries after the battle because it meant that a lot of cities and towns nearby couldn't be looted or sacked, because that was the way they were going to make their money and effectively come out of this battle quite rich. The fact that it was all over made it actually disappointed these bloodthirsty guys. They killed a lot of people and they were looking to get out of this and work their through. But Macedon will never, ever recover from this. And it is fully under Roman control. And that is it. It is the end of the historical Alexander the Great kingdom. Now, there are other Hellenistic kingdoms that will go on for centuries, but ultimately this is the end of Macedonian control, where it's Greek control in Greece with Romans. That is it. Macedon will never recover from it. So, Cathal, that was a long-winded, very detailed, very infantry-heavy battle where we had a lot of units, a lot of tactics, a lot of armor, a lot of equipment, a lot of everything. Units versus units, infantry and infantry, head-on clash. What did the history machine think of it?
So I think this is an interesting one because it gave the Romans about a 65% chance to win this. And they had the slightly smaller army, and the differences in army composition are quite subtle in some cases, but I suppose at this point it's been able to recognize this is kind of a changing of eras, going from one type of army to another, and it's given them the advantage based on that. That, or it thinks that elephants are just 15% of cool, and make that big a difference. But like, yeah, one way or the other, it does see that there is a slight difference in this armies that has become significant. And maybe it doesn't know about how they're deployed formation wise, but it just sees that these are the unit types now, and they are just better than what has existed before. In terms of casualties suffered, the Romans had about 12% fewer than expected. The casualties dealt, as expected, are huge, 60% larger than expected.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Now, it was, as I've described it there, it was a bloodthirsty frenzy.
Yeah.
Now we can. It just became a slaughter.
Yeah, the history machine accounted for them like that. They probably should have won that battle, but it did not expect them to go that extreme in terms of just killing the opponents and not allowing surrender.
Oh, wow. Now, I'll finish up in a couple of notes. I know we mentioned a little bit earlier where this is meant to be the era where the Macedonian phalanx goes, it's obsolete now. Now, keep in mind, a pike formation is going to be used in like the 1600s. It's not gone. It doesn't disappear overnight. It's going to be used for centuries later by all different kinds of kingdoms. So it doesn't just disappear. Because, as I said, this is the battle that makes it look like the Roman system is now better than the Greek system, and that is that, and this battle determines that's what happened and why. But keep in mind, now there's a lot of ifs here. Keep this big pinch of salt coming here. But if the Macedonians were able to keep a level terrain, and if the Macedonians didn't press forward but kept a very uniform line, and that could have been required through drills and tactics and practices and whatever it might have been, the army was more whipped into shape. And if they could keep a straight line, if they could ensure their flanks, it is very hard to imagine the Romans could ever have punched through the front wall of spears that they were against, because for most of that battle, they couldn't. And it was only when these gaps open up from the advancement, from the kind of zigzagging of just people going forward and back, that it happened. By no means can we possibly, and feel free to let us know, but this is the moment where it says the Roman army is now better than the Greek army. And you can say, yes, it is. It's better drilled, it's better equipped, it's better troops. But if I were to get at this time a bunch of a small militia and arm them in a Macedonian style phalanx and put them on ideal terrain, this is the very important thing. You got to fight in very specific conditions against another group of people that I just raised up and said, you fight in the Roman style of war. Who would win and why? And you could say that the Romans don't just have the unit type and the tactics and the gear that makes it works. They have a lot of cultural factors as well. It's not as easy just to shape up and say that now the maniple is more superior than the phalanx. And, as I said, it's more flexible. It's better under things. And these are always ideal conditions because you can fight with Romans on rough terrain. You can fight with Roman type units in more close, it depends in different situations. But the Macedonian infantry, under the right conditions, under the right terrain, seems to be impossible to break through.
If you imagine this happening in, say, like a valley with like flat ground and steep sides that you can't go around, if it's just straight ahead versus straight ahead, it's hard to see the Romans winning this. If they can't kind of create those gaps or create.
Yes.
If it's like the disadvantage of the phalanx there is just like it can't really pivot as easily.
Yeah, very true.
Find those edges, but yeah, straight ahead versus straight ahead, and even the history machine, even with the conditions that were there, it still had it 1 time out of 3 that the Macedonians would have won. So it definitely wasn't a sure thing.
Okay, that's very fair. I will make an argument that terrain is what made this battle. Now, it made this battle possible. It's the fact that they were protected by a mountain and protected by the sea. But the other part is to ensure the absolute cohesion of the Macedonian phalanx. I wouldn't write it off just yet. And it doesn't disappear because the Roman infantry does. In the Dark Ages and later, you're not going to see legions anymore. They disappear. But you will see phalanxes. Now, whether that's organically or, or an example of a converging idea, that's all separate.
I'm cheering for my favorite thing of boring logistics again, because it's just so much cheaper and faster to train people in the phalanx style than a complicated Roman thing that requires arming them with swords.
Yeah. Now, I'll go back to our earlier when we were saying that post-Marian reforms, that legionnaire seems to be, the best possible infantryman you could possibly produce. And if that kind of a unit type does happen to take on a Greek army, it has to be very cautious. It can't charge the way it wants to, go head first, fire a bunch of heavy javelins into the enemy, and cut them up to pieces. It has to be very, very wary of just how good offensively and defensively a very well put together, perfect, ideal Macedonian phalanx is. So, interesting battle where you see the clash of technologies, the clash of ideologies, the clash of tactics. The Romans come out on top, and they are the betting favourite. You know, the history machine preferred it.
Yeah, being big enough to have the opportunity to make mistakes and come back is a huge thing.
Yes, yeah. It sounds like if you were to make an ideal army at this time, you would probably have the very center of it heavy Macedonian type infantry and have the wings, and this is like Alexander's army, and have the wings much more heavy infantry, but not that style, more flexible. He had the shield bearers and equivalents and other units and troops. So it seems to have, if you have an army well composed with different unit types of both shock troops and skirmisher troops with some good cavalry, you're probably going to do very well. So, as I said, don't write them off just yet. Even though this battle, that seems to be the findings of most historians and most analysts, is like, listen, this is just where the Romans show they're superior. But they did, but they also didn't. So for the first time ever, we will not do a countdown list. We don't have too many people to talk about here. There is only the couple of battles we covered there. So Paulus is pretty cool.
I'm voting for the guys dressed as anti-elephant Lego bricks for aesthetic reasons. That's how I'd build my ancient army.
And I'll vote for. Let me think about this one now. I've been showing a lot of love to the Macedonian phalanxes. I'm going to go for the bronze shields. Anyway, we're this is a one we're just messing about at the very end. But thank you very much for listening to this. We have the Pompeii episode that'll be coming out as well, and we're probably going to do another bonus episode on cavalry this time to go into what that is and how it functions and how it helps the infantry and the big difference between the two. But I have been Niall,
And I've been Cathal.
and you'll hear us again soon.